Hello friends, it is nice to be together here on the screen. Today you start with a new series of lessons, 12 lessons, and the topic will be the Apostolic Fathers. And this first lesson of 12 will be an introduction. Let me first introduce myself. You can already see under the screen, my name is Jos. I am from Holland and I lived about half of my life here in Egypt. In the past, long ago, I studied history of the Middle East. I have a master's in history. I also, after that, studied theology, and I have a PhD in theology. And I love that combination of history and theology, and that is why I'm so interested in church fathers and in the study of the Apostolic Fathers in particular. Apostolic Fathers, what do we mean with that term? Well, we use it to designate a collection of writings from the late 1st and early 2nd century, so books and letters that were written very shortly after the New Testament. The writers of these letters were not apostles, not themselves, but they all knew the apostles. They knew Peter and Paul and John and the other apostles that were following Jesus. But those original apostles had now died. Would the young, persecuted church survive? The writings of the Apostolic Fathers give us some wonderful insight into that period of the very early church. Now, for this course, we use a very beautiful book called the Apostolic Fathers. You already guessed. In the lessons, you will receive, each time you will receive a PDF for reading that comes from this book, but I strongly urge you to buy the book and put it beside your bed and read it before you sleep. It is really very interesting literature. The writings in this book are very diverse. You will find the pastoral letter of Clement. We call it the first letter of Clement. He was the bishop of the city of Rome, and he wrote to the church in Corinth. You will find the Pastor of Hermas, a very strange book full of visions and dreams. And then you have the Didache. That was a handbook for church leaders in the 2nd century of how to baptize, how to celebrate Holy Eucharist, and that sort of thing. And you will see how these different writers, how different they all were, but they were all from the same period, from about 100 to 150 after Christ. They all lived in the Roman Empire, so they shared to a certain extent the same context, the same circumstances. And let me introduce this lesson by saying a few things about those similar circumstances. The first major issue they had was tension with the Jewish synagogue. The followers of Jesus Christ, most of them had come from the synagogue, most of them had a Jewish background. They had problems with those Jewish people who did not follow Jesus. After the temple was destroyed in the year 70, the Jewish religion was changing very fast. They did not have a temple anymore. And instead of worshipping in the temple, their focus of Judaism became the study of the Torah, their holy writings. So not the Jewish priest, but the Jewish teacher, the rabbi, became the central person. The followers of Jesus Christ also had to define themselves. How do we relate to those Jewish people who do not follow Jesus Christ? How are we different from the Jewish religion? How do we understand the Holy Scriptures that are used in the Jewish synagogue, that we also use, but we use them differently? What is the difference? Barnabas, in a long sermon that you will read, he, for instance, explained that the Jews had always misunderstood their Holy Scriptures. They should not have taken it so literally, but much more spiritually, is what he says. And the tension between the church and the synagogue increased slowly, and you see that reflected in the writings of the Apostolic Fathers. But the church also had to develop itself internally. Now, in the time when the apostles were still alive, if you as a church had a problem or a theological question and you couldn't solve it, what did you do? You could ask the apostles. They had known Jesus Christ, and their opinion was seen as most important. But now those apostles had died. So what to do? The generation of the first followers of Jesus had passed away, but what to do? Well, what happened was that very quickly the bishop in every city where there was a church became the central person in the church. If you want to know what to believe, ask the bishop. If you want to know how to live, how to work, how to live a Christian life, ask the bishop. He became the heart of church life. About this issue we read, for instance, in the letters of Ignatius. He was a bishop in Antioch, and he was taken captive by the Romans to be killed in the city of Rome around the year 115. And he says, without a bishop there is no church, and without the bishop there is no Eucharist. Clement, in his letter that we will read next week, he writes that the apostles, knowing that these problems would come over the early church, had appointed leaders to succeed them. And Clement says, the apostles told their successors that they had to appoint their successors. You hear that? Already in the letter of Clement, written around 96 after Christ, we see the issue of apostolic succession come into shape. Well, it is very interesting to see in the writings of the Apostolic Fathers also what letters from the New Testament they started to quote. In all these writings you see that they quoted from the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke. Slowly you see that they start to quote from the Apostle Paul and Peter and John, and they also started to consider that Holy Scripture. So the church started to develop a canon of holy writings. A third circumstance that all these churches shared in the Roman Empire was tension between the church and the state. When the temple was destroyed in 70 after Christ, most apostles had already been killed in persecutions by the Romans. It started in the year 64 when the Emperor Nero blamed the Christians for a big fire in the city of Rome. And after that, the relationship between the church and the state was always problematic. Now, until the year 250 or so, there were no Roman Empire-wide persecutions that lasted very long. The persecutions were regional and sporadic. But if you have a little persecution here and there, and we know this all too well in the church here in Egypt, if you have them every now and then, you still realize that as a church you have to be very careful. Bishop Ignatius was killed in the city of Rome, and he wrote some great letters that we will read. And Bishop Polycarp, he was murdered by the Romans in Smyrna, now called Izmir in Turkey. And thanks to that, we now have a beautiful book called The Martyrdom of Polycarp. But I've said enough, this is just an introduction. Please read the text for this lesson and then answer the questions with the lesson. And if you have any questions, you can ask those, of course, through the system. And again, try to buy this book. It is really very worthwhile. Buy this book. See you again next time.